In the late autumn of 1940, in the corridors of the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, where the air still carried the smell of coal smoke and fresh paper from recently printed directives, the leadership of Nazi Germany discussed a distant power across the Atlantic with a tone of certainty that allowed no doubt. The United States was not yet a belligerent, but it was already present in German calculations as an abstract quantity, reduced to stereotypes, economic tables, and ideological assumptions. For Adolf Hitler and his closest circle, America was viewed less as a strategic opponent than as a theoretical problem already solved by doctrine. The discussion took place not in the language of contingency, but in the language of inevitability, shaped by years of racial ideology and selective reading of recent history. Hitler's private monologues, recorded by aides and reflected in memoranda, consistently portrayed the United States as a society without inner cohesion, dominated by material comfort, racial mixture, and political indecision. In his view, such a society could generate wealth, but not endurance, factories, but not discipline, machinery, but not sacrifice. This interpretation was reinforced by the American experience of the First World War, where the United States had arrived late, fought briefly, and demobilized rapidly, returning to isolation. German planners treated this precedent not as a unique historical moment, but as a permanent national characteristic, failing to distinguish between political choice and structural capacity. Within the Wehrmacht and the economic ministries, intelligence assessments of the 1930s were filtered through the same lens. Reports emphasized labor unrest, the Great Depression, congressional resistance to rearmament, and the apparent slowness of American military expansion. The absence of mass conscription, the small size of the peacetime army, and the visible prioritization of civilian consumption were interpreted not as latent potential, but as fixed limitations. German analysts compared American military indicators directly to European standards, assuming that what was not yet mobilized could not be mobilized at scale. This analytical shortcut became institutional habit. The error was not a lack of data, but a failure of interpretation. German intelligence had access to American industrial statistics, population figures, and production methods, yet these were read selectively. Mass production was acknowledged, but its strategic implications were minimized. Standardization was seen as a commercial advantage, not as a weapon. The idea that a democratic society could reorganize itself for total war faster than authoritarian states was dismissed as ideological contradiction. In Berlin, certainty replaced analysis. By the end of 1940, this assessment had hardened into doctrine. America was categorized as a secondary threat, dangerous in theory but slow in execution, powerful in numbers but weak in will. Strategic planning moved forward on this assumption, quietly locking the Reich into a confrontation whose real parameters it had not yet measured. What appeared in Berlin as clarity was in reality the first step into a miscalculation that could no longer be reversed once events began to move. In 1939 and early 1940, German analysts studying the American economy observed a landscape that appeared to confirm every ideological expectation. The industrial cities of the Midwest produced automobiles, refrigerators, radios, and agricultural machinery in vast quantities. Yet almost none of this output had an explicitly military character. Assembly lines were optimized for consumer demand, factories closed on weekends, and unemployment, though declining, remained visible. From Berlin, this peacetime normality was read as strategic weakness. The German leadership equated the absence of tanks, aircraft, and artillery with an inability to produce them in decisive numbers, committing a fundamental analytical error, confusing current output with structural capacity. The core of this misjudgment lay in the German conception of industrial readiness, which had been shaped by European experience. In the Reich, rearmament had required years of centralized planning, political coercion, and ideological mobilization, and even then it strained resources and labor. German economists assumed that industrial conversion was inherently slow, disruptive, and limited by institutional friction. When American factories did not immediately resemble armament plants, German observers concluded that transformation would be equally cumbersome if it occurred at all. They failed to recognize that American industry had been designed from its inception for rapid reconfiguration, driven by interchangeable parts, standardized processes, and decentralized decision-making. Statistical comparisons reinforced this illusion. In 1939, American aircraft production lagged behind that of Germany, Britain, and France combined, while tank production was negligible. These figures were accurate, but they described a snapshot, not a trajectory. German planners treated them as fixed indicators, overlooking the significance of capital depth, machine tool availability, and workforce scalability. The American automobile industry alone possessed production lines capable of output measured not in dozens, but in tens of thousands, a scale unfamiliar to European military industry. To German eyes, this civilian excess appeared inefficient rather than latent. Equally damaging was the ideological filter applied to labor and management. German doctrine assumed that democratic negotiation between government, industry, and labor would paralyze decision-making under crisis. Strikes, union contracts, and corporate autonomy were interpreted as obstacles incompatible with total war. What was missed was the American tradition of contractual mass coordination, in which private firms could be synchronized through incentives rather than coercion. The absence of visible compulsion was mistaken for the absence of control. By late 1940, German reports continued to emphasize what America was not producing, rather than what it could produce once political constraints were lifted. This analytical fixation on peacetime indicators blinded Berlin to the fact that the United States was measuring time differently. While Germany counted existing divisions and current factories, America possessed an industrial reserve that had not yet been activated. The moment that reserve would be released remained outside German calculations, but it was approaching, and when it arrived, it would invalidate every assumption made in peace. The decisive rupture in German calculations occurred not gradually, but abruptly, beginning in 1941 and accelerating after December, when the United States crossed from political support to direct belligerency. What followed was not a conventional mobilization, but an industrial transformation without European precedent. In a matter of months, the American economy shifted from civilian abundance to military saturation, exposing the fatal flaw in Berlin's analytical framework. German planners had expected delay, resistance, and inefficiency. Instead, they encountered velocity. The institutional mechanism behind this shift was deliberately simple. Washington did not attempt to replicate European-style centralized command of every factory. Instead, coordination was imposed through contracts, quotas, and guaranteed financing, allowing private industry to reorganize itself at scale. The creation of the War Production Board formalized priorities, but it did not micromanage methods. This distinction was decisive. American firms converted existing plants rather than constructing entirely new ones, and they did so using familiar processes adapted to military specifications. The automobile industry ceased producing cars and began producing engines, tanks, and aircraft components with minimal interruption. From the German perspective, the most incomprehensible element was tempo. Factories that German intelligence had classified as irrelevant civilian assets became core military producers within weeks. The Willow Run plant, initially dismissed as an impractical experiment, achieved output figures that exceeded entire national production totals elsewhere. Shipyards launched standardized cargo vessels faster than German submarines could sink them. Aircraft production curves rose not linearly but exponentially, invalidating all previous tonnage and sortie calculations made in Berlin. This collapse of prediction was rooted in structural misunderstanding. German planners had assumed that complexity increased friction. In reality, American standardization reduced it. Aircraft types were simplified, components were interchangeable, and training pipelines were synchronized with production schedules. Losses at the front could be replaced not by drawing down reserves, but by continuous industrial flow. Germany, operating a quality-focused but fragmented system, could not replicate this model under bombing and resource scarcity. By mid-1942, the discrepancy was no longer theoretical. Monthly American production figures exceeded German annual expectations drafted only 2 years earlier. The problem for Berlin was not merely numerical inferiority, but the realization that the gap was widening faster than any military operation could close it. Every strategic choice made since 1940 had been based on the assumption that American power would arrive late and incomplete. It arrived early, organized, and cumulative. At this point, German leadership faced an unspoken recognition. The war had entered a phase governed not by battlefield brilliance, but by industrial arithmetic. The question was no longer whether the United States could produce enough, but whether Germany could endure long enough for production to matter. The answer was already forming in the factories, shipyards, and assembly lines across America, and it would soon be measured at sea. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, the Atlantic appeared, from Berlin's perspective, to validate years of German confidence. German submarines operated deep along the American coastline, sinking merchant ships in visible proximity to illuminated cities, while poorly coordinated defenses and inexperienced escorts produced what U-boat commanders described as a second happy time. Reports flowing back to the headquarters of the Kriegsmarine confirmed high sinkings and low losses, reinforcing the belief that the United States lacked both the technical competence and organizational discipline to secure its sea lanes. Yet beneath these tactical successes lay a strategic miscalculation that turned submarine warfare into an exercise in self-deception. The German U-boat campaign was built on arithmetic. Victory depended not on individual sinkings, but on maintaining a sustained imbalance between Allied ship losses and Allied ship construction. This logic had worked earlier in the war, when British shipbuilding capacity was limited and replacement lagged behind destruction. German planners assumed that American industry would follow similar pattern, requiring years to expand, train labor, and construct shipyards. What they failed to grasp was that the United States approached shipbuilding not as a craft, but as a system. Beginning in 1942, American shipyards applied industrial principles previously reserved for automobiles to maritime construction. Standardized hull designs, modular assembly, and simplified welding techniques reduced production time to weeks rather than months. Liberty and Victory ships were launched at a rate that shattered German expectations, rendering individual sinkings strategically irrelevant. For every ship destroyed by a U-boat, several more entered service, often before the loss had even been registered in operational planning. German command struggled to adapt its calculations. Tonnage sunk continued to rise, but the strategic effect declined. The Atlantic ceased to be a finite space of attrition and became a conveyor belt delivering uninterrupted material flow to Britain and later to the European continent. Meanwhile, Allied anti-submarine warfare improved systematically. Escort numbers increased, air coverage expanded, and detection technologies multiplied, not through single breakthroughs, but through cumulative refinement and mass deployment. By 1943, the mathematical balance had inverted. U-boats were no longer trading ships for time, but submarines for diminishing returns. Losses among trained crews became irreplaceable, while American shipyards operated beyond the reach of German weapons. The ocean remained the same, but the numbers governing it had changed, and they now pointed inexorably toward a different kind of defeat, one that would soon extend from the sea into the sky.
By 1943, the air war over Europe had become the most unforgiving test of the competing economic systems, and it was here that the German misreading of American capacity reached its most destructive expression. The leadership of the Luftwaffe had entered the conflict with a conception of air power rooted in pre-war experience, limited campaigns, decisive engagements, and the belief that superior aircraft and elite pilots could compensate for numerical inferiority. This model assumed that losses, while painful, would remain manageable. It collapsed when confronted with an opponent that treated aircraft and crews as reproducible elements of a continuous system. American air strategy did not depend on avoiding losses, but on absorbing them. The production logic of the United States Army Air Forces aligned factories, training bases, and operational units into a single flow. Aircraft types were standardized, maintenance procedures simplified, and pilot training scaled to produce consistent, adequate proficiency rather than individual brilliance. German intelligence, still influenced by pre-war statistics, underestimated this approach, assuming that quality degradation would follow expansion. Instead, the Americans accepted acceptable averages and compensated with volume and rotation. German aircraft production, though technologically sophisticated, remained fragmented. Multiple variants, frequent design changes, and resource shortages disrupted output and complicated maintenance. Each new model promised technical superiority but required time, specialized labor, and retraining, all of which were in short supply under sustained bombing. Meanwhile, American factories delivered thousands of identical aircraft, allowing damaged units to be replaced, crews to be reassigned, and operational tempo to be maintained without interruption. The decisive factor was not aerial combat skill, but temporal endurance. German pilots were retained at the front until death or exhaustion, accumulating experience but leaving no reserve. American crews rotated after fixed tours, preserving institutional memory while preventing irreversible attrition. Losses that crippled German squadrons became for the United States statistical fluctuations within a larger system. The sky itself became an arena governed by replacement rates rather than tactics. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe still possessed capable aircraft and courageous pilots, but it no longer possessed time. Fuel shortages limited training, experienced leaders were gone, and new pilots arrived with minimal preparation. Against them stood an opponent whose air power regenerated faster than it could be destroyed. The German assumption that air superiority could be contested indefinitely proved false. The war in the air was not lost in a single battle, but in the relentless accumulation of losses that could not be replaced. What emerged was a reality German planners had never fully considered. Modern air war was not a duel of aces, but an industrial process measured in training hours, spare parts, and monthly output. Once that arithmetic turned against Germany, no tactical adaptation could reverse it. The sky, like the Atlantic before it, had become a domain where endurance outweighed excellence, and the final test would soon be applied not to machines, but to men on the ground. By the beginning of 1943, the last remaining German assumption about the United States rested on the human dimension. Even as industrial and logistical calculations collapsed, German command culture continued to believe that American soldiers themselves would remain the weak link, poorly trained, psychologically fragile, dependent on material comfort, and incapable of sustained adaptation under fire. Early encounters appeared to support this belief. American units performed unevenly in their first engagements in North Africa, culminating in defeat at Kasserine Pass, an episode quickly absorbed into German internal reporting as confirmation that American manpower lacked resilience and depth. Yet this interpretation repeated the same analytical mistake made in industry and air power, judging a dynamic system by its initial state. What German planners failed to understand was the organizational culture underpinning the United States of America war effort. Defeat was not treated as disgrace, but as data. After Kasserine, command structures were revised, training programs rewritten, and leadership replaced without ideological hesitation.
The American system absorbed failure rapidly and institutionalized correction, converting battlefield experience into standardized instruction distributed across the force. German command culture, by contrast, increasingly treated setbacks as moral failings or isolated betrayals, discouraging structural reform at precisely the moment it was most needed. American manpower policy was built around rotation, replacement, and learning. Units were replenished, retrained, and returned to combat with accumulated institutional knowledge rather than exhausted veterans clinging to diminishing effectiveness. German formations, especially on the Western Front after 1943, experienced the opposite trajectory, shrinking cadres of experienced soldiers surrounded by increasingly undertrained replacements, bound to rigid doctrine and deprived of time to adapt. The human war became an extension of the industrial one, governed by regeneration rather than endurance alone. By 1944, the contrast was unmistakable. American ground forces demonstrated consistent operational competence across multiple theaters, supported by logistics that ensured ammunition, food, medical care, and rest cycles at a scale Germany could no longer match. The German belief that material abundance would soften American soldiers proved false. Instead, it sustained them, allowing prolonged operations without collapse. Morale followed structure, not ideology. In the final phase of the war, German leadership confronted the cumulative result of its original misjudgment. The United States had proven capable not only of producing weapons, ships, and aircraft, but of producing trained soldiers, leaders, and organizational learning faster than losses could erase them. The initial assessment of America as a shallow, disunited society had failed at every level: industrial, operational, and human. The strategic error was irreversible because it was foundational. Germany had entered the war against an opponent it believed it understood and planned accordingly. By the time reality corrected that belief, the correction itself had become decisive. The war ended not with the collapse of a single front, but with the quiet confirmation that the original assumption had been wrong and that everything built upon it had fallen in sequence.